All right, hi everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Subseasonal Forecast Contest. We're going to be following our usual schedule today. We'll go through some attribution, talk about the most recent verification. We'll talk about this week's new forecast. We'll give time for our special guests from the University of Missouri to introduce themselves, and then we'll kind of see where the conversation goes from there. Today, Michael Garoon will be leading the discussion. So, Mike, I will hand it over to you.
Yep, thanks. Okay, so I'm just gonna share my screen so we can get started. So usually what we do, just go over it real quick just in case you don't know. We usually start off by going over the most recent verified forecast, which this one. Yes. So, start off with this. Verification was 125.5 HDDs, which was lower than everything that we have here. Closest forecast overall was a 5-year moving average. Closest human forecasters were myself and Dr. Decker, and Dave was not too far behind either. Overall, so not a bad week for human forecasters compared to the previous few forecasts where there were pretty large busts. CFS and EC, despite being very close to each other, continue to present very little skill in the long range, it seems. And again, a very warm verification. I can take a look if, give me a moment and just get this. Let's see, that was 26 to 22. Take a look at the map.
Other way.
Oh yeah. Oops. Going back in time with that one. So yeah, very warm across most of the country, with the exception of the deep south. So kudos if anyone had that in their forecast. But yeah, you know, all the big HDD producers, Chicago, New York, Philly, etc., the entire Northeast, all just very warm for this period. So does anyone have anything that they wanna mention? Anything they want to talk about on this?
Michael, this is Dave. Any other particular thoughts as to why, I guess in particular, the model data, the ECCFS were so cold and so wrong? Were you able, do you want to maybe pull up the Maxar report from that period?
Sure.
Might be able to get some information there.
So this would be, when was this forecast? 7. January 7th.
The nice thing about this Maxar report, for folks seeing it for the first time, well, they have an archive. So, you know, we're able to go back to see what the forecast was on Jan 7th. And as Michael will show you here in a second, you don't have the upper air data, which is unfortunate, but at least you can see the surface composites, and, you know, kind of see what the models were projecting.
Yeah, so it looks like they were expecting a lot of cold out west and in the Midwest, as well as the CFS was starting to spill that cold into Chicago and into Maine, even, and some of the parts of the Northeast a little bit. So there was a lot of cold that didn't end up materializing, and just kind of reading, and since the forecast for Maxar seems to match both the models, seems like they were really expecting the MJO to be in phase 7 to start bringing in the colder air, in spite of the stronger polar vortex. At least that's what I'm reading.
And Michael, can we see the verification again? Can you just kind of toggle
Yeah.
back and forth a little bit?
Oh, the verification.
Yeah, just yeah, we
Subsys-
toggle back and forth. So what? So and I'm not laughing because my forecast is so much better. It's humbling, right? It's humbling. So basically, the verification was almost 180 degrees what the model showed. So instead of the cold being focused north and west, it was south and east. Am I looking at that right?
Yeah, because it's even funnier considering that the only area that was warm on both models was the area that ended up being colder.
Yeah, yeah. And so, I mean, that brings up, I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on this, with our research hats on. Uh, I understand why, and it's, again, I wish, Maxar, we're not trying to pick on Maxar. It's sort of unfair that they're not here either. But like they mentioned, and there's probably some support for this, that their forecast was, if you go back to the report, is somewhat of a function of the progression of the MJO. And maybe you could even pull up, if you had this up, Michael, the MJO forecast. But they were talking about the fact that it was projected to go into phase 6, 7 at the time, and that supports the cold north and west. So, I mean, my only point is, it would seem like this was a situation, right? So this forecast right back on the 7th. And in some respects, they were absolutely right in terms of the progression of the MJO, right? I mean, that part of it, plus or minus worked out. What didn't work out was at least their interpretation of the canonical response or whatever to that MJO progression. It just didn't happen. I don't know. Does anyone have any thoughts as to why we didn't see the kind of response that Maxar was kind of suggesting?
I'll venture a guess that maybe um, I think the polar vortex was up near what was it, Siberia during this period, and you know, with a leading to a strong positive AO, and I don't really think that you can get too strong of a cold outbreak um, with a strongly positive AO like this. I mean, it wasn't that. I guess it wasn't that strongly positive, but still positive. And I don't. I just don't think you can get cold like this without having some support from either the AO or a piece of the polar vortex.
Mike, can you go back to that AO again? Can we see what
Yeah.
the forecast? It's not the 16 to 20, but at least we can see the date forecast at the bottom. See how
Yeah. Let's see. So it looks like there was a pretty widespread at 14 days.
and my suggestion there, my only point was going to be that maybe it underestimated how positive the AO was, but doesn't that forecast doesn't look terrible.
Um, Maybe I mentioned something in my forecast about it.
So one thing I'm confused about in, I guess, that Maxar discussion or that forecast, I noticed our MJO analog was consistent with warmer conditions. So based on that big excursion into that phase 4, 5, yeah, wherever it actually was on January 1st, past events have been warm. So I thought it was kind of interesting. Yeah, I guess being there in phase 4 when the forecast was made, that was a pretty strong warm signal based on our analog data. So I'm just curious with how I guess they just discounted that, or they're using the MJO in a different way, perhaps. But it seems like this warmth might be consistent with that strong phase 4. And if I remember right from the plot that Dave has, even phase 5 has if you look 2-3 weeks later, pretty warm in terms of the HGDs based on past events.
That's a great point. I think that's an interesting research exercise that, obviously we can't always do all these things, but this, we talk a lot. I think we had a discussion about this 2 or 3 weeks ago where we were reading like a report from Maxar and reading a report from someone else, and they had 2 different interpretations of the same data. Right? They had 2 different interpretations of what the MJO meant to the forecast. One, I think, saying it was a cold signal, and one saying it was something else. I think that's interesting because I see what you're saying, Professor Decker, in terms of, maybe the interpretation of that was someone could have interpreted that differently. And I wonder too, with my research hat on, Michael, back to your screen, one thing we see with that MJO, at the time it was strengthening, it was amplifying into phase 5. I'm putting my subjective hat on, just my experiential hat on, and I'm also playing super Monday morning quarterback. But in my experience, that I think when it's still amplifying in the maritime continent there, that can also be, I would love to test this, but I think that can also be a signal for warmth, as opposed to if it were just moving east to west, or west to east in this case. If it were like, kind of darting into 6-7, as opposed to growing into the maritime continent. Again, experientially, to me, that sometimes could be a warning flag. Don't go cold too quickly, because they're still, there might be a little bit more of a lag.
At least looking at my forecast, I mentioned that I treated the MJO as a warm signal partly because of the MJO analog. So my interpretation using the lag composites was also warm. So when I saw that on their page that it mentioned the MJO being a cold signal, I was also a little confused.
This is exactly why it's great to have some of these, like the tools that Dr. Decker helped create, our little MJO analog, because at the end of the day, in a lot of respect, we're just trying to test these rules of thumb, right? And so that we can get through this fog of interpreting these things as a cold or warm signal. It's never going to be perfect, but these kinds of things always frustrate me, right? It's like, it's like how we can look at the same thing and come to different conclusions on it.
I can tell you a little bit from the private sector here, what the read was here in early Jan, that the large, strong eastward propagating mode coming through the eastern Indian Ocean and maritime continent, so the big 4-5 projection was deemed to be pretty solid negative PNA, warm eastern 2/3 of the nation view for the first, say, at least half of January. But that I remember the medium range models at the time taking the substantial amount of Arctic air over Alaska associated with the best tropospheric polar vortex lobe at the time, and depositing more of that into southwestern and west central Canada. And in general, when you deposit a ton of Arctic air right on the doorstep, and then you have a strong eastward propagating mode come across the Central Pacific, you're going to change the eddy tilts across the northern Pacific sector, such that you're going to try to build some kind of ridging off the west coast. And when it's 20 degrees below normal in Calgary, and you start having positive height changes west of the U.S., it doesn't take much to get that down into the plains and Midwest. So I think that's where the private sector had the energy support floor mets, myself included, were kind of warm up until about the 15th or the 20th, somewhere in that in January, and that's where I think you're seeing some of this thought bleed into the Earthsat outlook. If you go back and look what happened, rather than body and soul take all of that good cold air built up over western and southwestern Canada, you split it and you dump some back into the Gulf of Alaska, and you got only a little chunk that came southeast. That was a big screw job in the January forecast.
And just to echo that, Michael, this is the last thing on my end anyway. If you go back to the forecast page, our forecast page, and just go to the next week, and misery loves company. So is Nat Johnson on the call? Is Nat? No, he's not. I remember Nat and I for this week saying, hey, a lot of indicators here that we're going to get cold, blah, blah, blah. It's finally coming. You can see my number up there, 167. I just checked to see what the latest estimate is in terms of how this is coming forward. And it's, it's only a couple days away. I think the estimate from Maxar right now is about $1.25, 125.
It's dirty.
So, that idea is not panning out for me either.
This January is going to go down as a kick to the crotch for dynamical subseasonal forecast methods, in my opinion. I've tried to post-mortem it myself to this point, and from the way I approach the GSDM process, I don't think I could have gotten away from it. The positive AO, so I hear some references to the positive AO, and I think that's a great point. But there are plenty of interesting midwinter cases where, especially in this weather climate regime, you can have a positive AO, a positive NAO, and as long as you have the right convective forcing in the West Central Pacific to drive the EPO and or WPO negative, you don't need a bit of help from the AO or NAO to get cold and stay cold. You just have to serially refire ridging up through Alaska. And so you have to constantly maintain this neutral or negative eddy tilt situation without overextending the Pacific jet across the Pacific pattern. But it looks like there's too complex a convective forcing to get that done this year. So the Western Indian Ocean plus the Central Pacific, in this case, it looked like it was just too complex to keep feeding a negative EPO. And if you couldn't do that, you split the cold source region air over Western Canada, dumped too much back into the Gulf of Alaska, and that was the escape route.
That's great.
That complex convective forcing shows up in the Hubmuller, so I think that's something good, in class or outside of this to look at. Look at the 200 millibar VP Hubmullers, and you can see the Western Indian Ocean never really turns off in a substantial way. It's kind of always there. The Central Pacific, surges. You have some nice flares at time, and this was a hellacious MJO that came right through the Central Pacific. So again, with tons of cold air right on the doorstep and a really nice Central Pacific convective flare, what the hell else do you need to do? If you're not going to get cold with that, how are you going to get cold?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. And certainly it's certainly verified, and it seems like it's going to continue to verify for at least the near future, at least for that verification. So does anyone have anything else they want to add to this this portion before we move on to the next part?
Dave, I have a real quick suggestion for maybe some offline challenges to some of the other folks that you use on some of the panels and that you cooperate with. I think a real big operational question for this winter is why in the hell was the AO so positive through the middle part of winter here with the solar min and active convective forcing? I mean, to have a wildly positive early to mid Jan AO, that was nobody had that expectation coming in a low frequency, preseason, pre-month view.
That's a great point. That's great. Thank you.
I have my pet theory that it's, the radiative cooling response after the early cold season beating that the Strat took, but I don't feel super awesome about it.
All right, Michael, we're probably ready to go to the forecast whenever you're ready.
Okay, so this is our current forecast period. Just gonna take a look. CFS and EC are our two coldest. Oops. CFS and EC are our two coldest. Gonna take this with a grain of salt as they haven't been particularly great this year. And then coming and rounding off the bottom is our friends at Maxar with 137. So now we can, excuse me, go through these. Does anyone want to volunteer to go first? If not, I can go first.
I guess since I need to run soon, I can go first.
Okay.
All right. So you can see my formula at the top there. I have my 140.5 HDDs as my forecast, and I also have my sigma, which is a little below average confidence. And then to the right, you can see my formula statement. So once again, taking a look at what's going on this week, I noted that tropical convection seems to be focused, stretching about from South America roughly into about India. That seems to be where the strongest convection is. And then you can also see another weaker pulse a little closer to the date line around 180 east-west. And that, if you look at the Wheeler-Hendon signal, you can see that that puts it roughly in the null signal right now, which makes this forecast a bit of a complication. But if we look at the forecasted models, we can see that they're sort of expecting the signal to propagate into phase 6 to start things off, and then potentially continue into either the null phase or possibly into phase 5 or somewhere there. It seems like the models are in some disagreement. So using my lag composites, I decided to use phase 6, and I picked an earlier lag because it seems like the models, the signal won't get into phase 6 until a bit later. You can see that we're sort of, if you 850 temperatures, and then if we do phase 6, I think this is not phase 6. Yeah, okay. If we do phase 6, you can sort of see that we expect a general signal for a potential trough in the east and a ridge in the west. If we look about lag 2 into about lag 3, which is probably roughly around the time where our forecast period starts. So putting that together, I treated the tropics as a slightly cold signal, since it seems like the MJO analog suggests chance for some more cold in the prominent HDD regions of Chicago and the Northeast. Although it should be noted that the northern tier in the northern plains looks warm, at least from the MJO signal in lag number 2. So next, taking a look at our friends at the CPC, we see that they're showing some cold in the north and some warmth in the south. Rather interesting dipole situation showing up here with equal chance in much of the country. So this, given that the primary areas of cold are in the northern regions where we're getting the most HDDs anyway, chances are, I interpreted this as a somewhat cold signal also. So that gives me about 144 for that. And next, looking at our teleconnections, I noted that the AO is forecast to remain positive. The NAO looks like it will dip into negative territory and then come back to about neutral, maybe even head into positive, especially if you look at some of the EC or Canadian ensembles. And then the PNA is forecasted to go from positive into negative. This is one of the bigger factors for my forecast. And then a complication is that if you look at the EPO, it appears that it might head into neutral or maybe even negative territory. So we see sort of a mixed signal with the teleconnections, but with the negative PNA and the positive AO and an uncertain EPO, I treated the teleconnections as a rather warm signal for this forecast. Once again, this one I think is up to interpretation, and depending on who's using the teleconnections, they might come up with something different. And then looking at the dynamical models, I noted that we see a broad trough in Eastern Canada in the ECMWF, with the trough coming in slightly farther south on the CFS. Now the result is that the CFS paints a fairly cold forecast, while the ECMWF is also a little cold compared to the 30-year normal. And once again, given the poor performance of the EC and CFS, I am weighting the CFS with 0% and the ECMWF with only 5%. So putting everything together, I got a final value of 141 HDDs, and I subtracted 0.5 because I believe that there's a risk for this time period to verify a little warmer than what I got. And given the disagreements between the MJO and some of the polar teleconnections, I kept my confidence below average.
Okay, thank you, Phil. Clear and concise as always. Does anyone have any questions for Phil?
Hey, Philip, I have a question for you. And I don't know if you've been on when we've started to do this, but we've tried to do these where we do these calls and we were sort of simulate like a industry experience, like you're making like a client call. You're talking to a client, and there might be a jerky client on the other end who's going to ask you hard questions and stuff. So I'll try to be jerky.
Okay.
No, but so tell me, so you're fading on the warmer side.
Let's see, 30-year average was 140, I think, right? Or is it 140? Oh, it turns out my value ends up being exactly the same as 30-year.
So how so how do you you put 10% weight on teleconnections? how do you interpret the teleconnections separately from the model data? And I don't have a lot of time. I'm wearing my industry hat now. I only have 2 minutes, Phil. So but real quick, tell me what you mean by that. If the EC model includes patterns in NAO and AO, why do you include that separately?
Because I sort of feel that the models aren't exactly treating the teleconnections exactly the same. And also the teleconnection values I'm getting, it puts more weight on the ensemble GEFS and the operational EC and Canadian rather than the EC weekly. So it's a little different.
Okay. Okay. And so what you're kind of telling me is that you think there could be situations where maybe there's a systematic bias as a function of what the models are projecting. Like, in other words, if these two situations may not be the same. EC model projecting 150 HDDs, but in scenario A, the AO is very negative. In scenario A, the AO is very positive.
Yeah.
Okay. And why do you, again, last jerky question, and I promise I'm done. Where does this theory come from?
I guess it comes from the overall last few weeks, looking at how the extended range models have been fairly poor performance compared to all the other forecasters. And because of that, I'm very skeptical of how the dynamical models are painting the areas of warm and cold.
Okay, thank you.
I have a quick question about the MJO composite analog lags. I haven't been in the room in a little while. So the lags, are these days or pentads?
I think they're pentads. After I took a look at a more detail at the information, I think it's pentads.
Okay, so you're using a current observation or a 5-day forecast of MJO phase 6 projection, and then using the 2 pentad lag to get you out into the 16 to 20.
Roughly, yes.
Got it. Okay. So in a practical matter, from a practical perspective, and also from a GSDM perspective, when trying to apply a lot of the Weichmann-Berry stuff, we found, well, first Ed Berry and Dr. Klaus Weichmann tried to do the lag off of observations, and in a operational setting, that just didn't work very well. What typically I find to work better, and I think what shows up better in the verification, is to forecast the index value, forecast the physical phenomena, and then go lag 0 off that. So it's almost better to try and forecast the MJO or the state of convective forcing into the 16 to 20, and then go lag 0 composites off that. So I guess my jerky, to borrow from Dave, my jerky stance would be, I get nervous about going with a 2 pentad lag off of a physical situation that's pretty damn complex when you look at the VP hub molars. I don't know that I think it's a long-winded way of saying I don't know that phase 6 is going to be the valid thing to use, especially with a 2 pentad lag here.
Okay. I guess I will take that into future account, since at least looking at the MJO signal, I was always a little uncertain about when was roughly the best choice to use, and I've been usually I try to go by day 0, like today's date, and then go with like a 3rd or 4th pentad. Now today happened to be a case where, because the MJO is in null phase, I wanted to take a more coherent signal, so I took it a few days ahead. But I will also take what you said into account.
That makes some sense, but also be careful using the RMMs, especially when you go into the sub 1 sigma zone. In this particular case, you're going sub 1 sigma not because there's convective forcing that is dying off. It's because there's multiple regions of convective forcing that are canceling out in the RMM space. So oftentimes it's somewhat better to try and get into the 200 millibar VP hub molars, find the areas of action, and then get into the 250 millibar winds and or 500 millibar height anomalies on a global projection, and find the wave energy dispersions that are coming off of those active regions of convection.
that does raise a possible research project. You know, we have this observation-based MJO analog looking at the current state of the MJO. But as you mentioned, another option is to look at a dynamical forecast out in the future and then do an analog based off of those forecasts. Or like Phil, right, there's a mix, right? Look partially into the future, but then also have a lag in your analog. So you could have, that's sort of like, you know, there's two ends of the spectrum, Phil is somewhere in between, but you could imagine testing, at least using past data. If we had enough forecasts, you know, all possible combinations of forecasts plus lag to add up to that 16 to 20 days and see with an exhaustive data set, which mix historically has performed the best.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
All right. Does anyone have anything else they want to add, or any more questions for Phil or anyone? All right. Thank you, Phil. Does anyone want to go next? If not, I'll volunteer myself as tribute.
I guess I could go since Phil mentioned the CPC forecast, and that's always my forecast technique is simply turn this into a number. So as Phil mentions, with the cold in the north, where there are more HDDs, so, you know, I'm thinking the blue outweighs the red because in California and Florida, there's a lower band, right? You can't have HDDs go below 0 if it's warm. So I did consider the blue, you know, below normal temperatures to outweigh the above slightly. So I did go with slightly elevated HDDs. I guess I'm one of the higher forecasts here. But with that large area of equal chances and the sort of implied gradient between cold north, warm south, you can imagine if that warm air gets a little further north or the cold air gets a little further south, it could have a big impact in the HDDs. The CPC forecast discussion also mentioned their confidence is quite low in the central and east, so I did bump up my sigma some to account for that uncertainty.
Yeah, I used this as part of my forecast as well, and I noticed that the first thing I noticed actually was that Chicago, New York, and all the other big cities in the Northeast are essentially a stone's throw away from below normal temperatures, and heck, Chicago's almost near the 55% below line. So definitely a colder HDD outlook, I would say, from the CPC, which so I'll just mention here is doing fairly well using Dr. Decker's method this year with a significant number of forecasts. So something to see if this verifies. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Decker about his forecast?
I was just going to say, and I know it feels like this discussion is always more questions than answers, but I just think the point he brings up about confidence related to the projected temperature pattern, you know, cold north, warm south, I think that's a really interesting point. And it's another one of those things I think would be great if we can test it at some point. The hypothesis being, or at least the test-ish being, you know, how much of confidence or uncertainty is, you know, a lot of times we interpret it in terms of pattern configurations, MJO, this, that, and the other thing. But how much is actually just related to the projected temperature pattern and the sensitivities to some of these key cities? And I think there's a reasonable, I think what Dr. Decker was suggesting, at least in part, was that there is a significant component there. And I suspect that that's right. It would be really interesting to test. Just forget everything else, MJO and stuff. But when the temperature configuration shows, you know, cold somewhere up north, and you have to define this, and warmth in the south, versus maybe the opposite, which is warmth up north and cool in the south, or some other configurations, how much does that influence model volatility or model error at the end of the day? And I haven't seen that analysis, but I'd love to see it because I think there could be something there.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea. All right. Got about 20 minutes left or so. So if no one has any other questions, I'm gonna keep the show moving. All right. I'll volunteer as tribute here. So my forecast was for 139.6 HDDs, with a slightly above average or slightly higher spread of 23.5, which is both of these are higher. Or okay, this is slightly lower than the 30-year normal of 140.5, and the spread is slightly higher than the spread of 19.7 for the 30-year normal. My formula is 60% various teleconnections, which I'll get into in a moment, 30% CPC, and 10% 30-year, which I use more of a baseline to start my forecast. So going through the teleconnections, this has already been gone through, so I'll just kind of go through it real quick. NAO looks to be going positive, as well as the AO. PNA negative. But to me, this was a trough west ridge east signal, which is kind of in disagreement with the CPC forecast, which has more of a trough central / east ridge west. So that's a big reason as to why I increased my my spread, because I I treated this as a risk to the forecast, with Chicago and New York and Philly, Boston, all big HDD producers at this point in the year, all right next to the cold on the doorstep, assuming the forecast will verify. Another risk would be the EPO, which is negative, so it won't take much, because I keep seeing all this cold air in Alaska, and if this EPO ridge can just push it into the country, if this ridge actually forms, then could see a little bit more cold air. Hence why I increased my my spread. Are there any questions for my forecast? Okay. If anyone thinks of a question, feel free to toss it out there. I'm still here. Um, who would like to go next? We still have Zach, Dave. I don't think Aaron's here, and I don't think Paul's here. So, Zach and Dave, you can draw straws to see which one of you wants to go.
Yeah, I'll go first. I'll go quickly since we still want to give a little bit of time for our new University of Missouri folks. This week I continued my forecast strategy of basically just taking percentages of the inputs we see on the table, but I did adjust my formula slightly because we got my first verification. And I was the only human forecaster to have a negative CRPS score, so obviously there was some need for adjustment there. I took out my weighting for the CFS. As we've seen countless times, its performance continues to be really poor, so I don't see any reason to keep it in my formula anymore. And if you go to the heating season of the last 30 days, any of the tables showing the heating season so far, the 10-year normal continues to be a pretty strong input. So I bumped up my weighting for the 10-year a little bit as well. So it comes out to about 50% 30-year, 30% 10, 10% trend, 10% EC, giving me a value of about 141.7. So then I was looking at some of the models to try and figure out if there was what sort of uncertainty we were looking at for the forecasts. I was looking at the Maxar page for the 500 millibar height departures. And if you look at the progression, especially in the EC, the progression from the 1 to 5, 5 to 10, 11 to 15, there's a lot of strong cold, it seems, covering most of the U.S. in those time periods leading up to our 16 to 20.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Potential for some potential, or see possibility that there could be some cold leading into this week, but that's why I bumped up my uncertainty in that regard. I made a couple quick notes about the teleconnection patterns in my description, but I think next week I'll try and, adopt my uncertainty scheme based around what some of the teleconnection patterns are as well. But right now, basically my uncertainty is bumped up because I saw some progression, a lot of cold leading up to our forecast period of interest, and see the potential that it could sway cold or warm in either direction.
Okay, thanks, Zach. Does anyone have any questions for Zach's forecast?
I just, I don't know if I have a question, but something Zach said made me think about the CFS, because I kind of feel the same way. Something about like not weighting it basically at this point, and yeah, I mean this has come up a couple times. I'm curious if anyone else has any thoughts on it. I mean, is there the scores on the CFS are terrible, right? I mean, there's no way around it. If you look at it, the bias, the errors and stuff, it feels like there's nothing there. But especially this heating season. But yeah, you could look there. Just the directional hit rate on the CFS as compared to normal. I looked at this earlier. Drop below 40%. Yeah, slightly below 40%. So in other words, it's much better, or it's better to go the opposite direction. But is there, there's the term, right, in the intelligence community about being a useful idiot or something like that. And in all seriousness, like, is there, I mean, if, does anyone have any thoughts? Like, should we just literally put 0% weight on this until the CFS gets better? Maybe there's, we don't bias correct here. It'd be interesting to see what a bias corrected, because I know this heating season, the bias is horrendous. If you just look at this heating season. Anyway, that's my question. I just wonder, should I put 0% weight on it, or is that not completely fair?
Something I'll toss out is maybe, and I don't know how you would implement this, but you could, since it's basically the opposite of whatever the CFS says happens, you could put like a reverse weight on it. So if CFS says cold, it's like, okay, treat it as a warm signal, but if it says warm, treat it as a cold signal kind of idea. Because more often than not, you'll probably be right that the opposite of the CFS is what's going to happen.
That's exactly what it's showing. Now, past performance is no guarantee of future returns, so to speak. But certainly, if you had done that for the last couple months, you would have performed. That would have helped. That would have been better than what the CFS showed, anyway.
I'd say going even back a full year, you probably would have done fairly well.
Yeah, I should say actually that record on the CFS is not the last 2 months. That's based off of over a year of data. So yeah, that's a long record of going opposite the CFS. Yeah.
All right. Back. So Dave, you're the last one before we let our guests from Missouri, University of Missouri, I think you said. So Dave, you're up.
Maybe just because I think we've had a lot of great discussion already, and I've already kind of hinted at my forecast. So I'm happy to pass my time over to Mr. Rankin and Dr. Lupo. If you guys have would like to share any thoughts, give us a little bit, maybe about your background and any thoughts on today's forecast, or just any if you want to share anything about your research and your interests and stuff. I'm sure we'd all love to hear it.
Yeah, I'm here, and I had to step away for a little bit and kept y'all on mute because I'm at my regular 9 to 5 at the BA. Doctor, as I said in the introduction, I've been working with Dr. Lupo now since 2013 for long range. Back then, it was considered just plain long range forecasting, but now obviously it's expanded into subseasonal. Dr. Lupo and I attended the Climate Prediction Center Diagnostic Workshop at St. Louis. I attended the one in Denver, presenting our Bering Sea and East Asia rule research. And then I presented the research at the AMS 2016 in New Orleans. And after that, we had our paper, we combined the St. Louis and the Denver papers along with the examples that we used during AMS New Orleans to create a peer review. And right now, we're working on two other research projects. One is the impact of a daily SOI change, whether it be a 10-point rise or drop on a daily basis or a 20-point rise and drop on a 3-day basis. I created composites that separated by INSO, season, fall, drop, 10-point and 30-point. So that's one of the research items that we're going to be using for this forecast, because I pushed it out to 25 days. The other research option that we have, or that we're working on, is I am taking the 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day CPC best 10 analogs, and I push it out to week 6. And at first I just was worried about weeks 3 and 4 and weeks 5 and 6. But once I started getting interested in this contest, I decided to go weekly also, so I can see trends of, well, yeah, you know, say weeks 3 and 4 was showing monster cold in the central United States, but, you know, that didn't necessarily tell me which time period. You know, did it happen in weeks 3 and 4, and then all of a sudden a correction came in week 4? You wouldn't know. So that's why I then started putting it into a weekly form, and I run those twice a week. Once on Mondays to prepare for the contest, and then also on Thursdays as kind of preparation to see what the CPC weeks 3 and 4 forecast on Friday morning / afternoon would show. Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you again.
Okay, I was going to say, wow, it just got really dead, and I was walking around the hospital, so I was trying to make sure that I still had everybody. So you know, that is the basis of what we're doing now. We're trying to get a paper created for the SOI change, because on numerous occasions, you know, we were able to see hints of what happens via that SOI change.
Yeah, I'll just say that that's really interesting to me, because that was I tried to use the SOI as part of my forecast last year, and I was never really able to get anything from it. I see these big dips in the SOI, or I think is when it goes negative, it's a colder signal. I was not a big expert on it.
Yeah.
But I usually tried that and it didn't quite work out for me. But so that's interesting. I think that's.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. Sorry to interrupt, but Ms. Rankin, if you have a minute, could you give a brief description about that? Some of the folks may not know what SOI is, and just sort of.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. The SOI is the Southern Oscillation Index, which is a measurement of the pressures between Tahiti and Darwin. And there's actually 2 different formulas. The Climate Prediction Center has one, and the Bureau of Meteorology, the Aussies, have another. And that's the Aussie version is the standard that you usually see when people start talking about the SOI. That's usually the equation that is used.
Thank you. And any quick highlights in terms of the relationship there with the weather patterns?
Yeah, it really depends on, and this is why the major reason why I did this when I informed you all that I separated by INSO, it is huge. The impacts of the INSO, not only that, but also of the rise and fall differences upon seasons too. because we're really trying to hone in on how it impacts the Rossby waves and the Pacific jet also. Because if you think about it, it does. It's a marriage of sorts, as I call it, between the MJO, because of Darwin's relationship to how close Darwin is to Indonesia and all the convection in Indonesia. So, we're trying to make that connection that way.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Joe, I was just curious. How did you hear about the contest? I mean, University of Missouri is not really one of those schools we've been talking to recently. I was just curious how you found out about it.
I saw it on Twitter.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, and I was going to say, Ms. Rankin there, we look forward to having you participate. Just let us know. I know there's, different, it takes a little while to get familiar with the framework and everything like that. So if you guys have any questions or anything like that, just please let us know. Or we do this occasionally too, and we could do this next time at the start of the discussion. Just kind of go through the Maxar website. I know there's a lot of great stuff there, but it's also, it's a little bit complicated or whatever.
That's what I was. We met with the students that we brought in last night, and as I described to them, it might be a little overwhelming to you kids. Exactly. Because it's huge. It's huge, and not only that, but the main thing that we're going to, because we're not, even though I'm familiar with weighted degree days, they didn't even know. Like you asked about the SOI, they didn't even know that much about teleconnections because they're kind of early in their education, and so trying to take what a 500 millibar map or a 2 meter temperature map anomaly and converting it to weighting degree days. That's for Dr. Lupo, that's the thing that him and I are going to kind of like try to play around with, going, okay, well, if right now it's showing that the weighted degree days is 150 as the 10-year normal. So, but it shows the Euro weeklies at 165, but ours are going to be, X amount of difference because we're warmer than they are. So trying to get that, testing, if you will. Yeah. That's what we'll probably run into.
Yeah. And, Zach just reminded me of this. So we don't have any scheduled industry guests next week. So we'd be happy to spend some time, dedicate a good chunk of the meeting to just kind of walking through the Maxar website and all the different tools. There's a lot of cool tools there. And I think that will help. They provide all the, you don't have to convert into weighting degree days, right? They do the conversion for you. So you're able to see maps.
Yep, on the right side. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So we can kind of go through the site next week. And if that's helpful, and if any of the folks in your group, any students or whatever would like to participate, they can. And actually that's a great lead in because the week after we actually have, our industry guest is from Maxar, one of the folks there.
Awesome.
So then by that point, if there's still any questions that we can't answer, they can certainly answer them.
Have you all thought with the spring season coming upon us, because, like I said, I just uploaded our week 6 and I included lift index composites. Have you all thought about going into maybe severe weather for this too also?
Yeah, that's a great question. Severe weather hasn't come up all that much, although that's interesting. But there have certainly been some different ideas on sort of different periods, different predictors or predicans and stuff like that. And we've always said that really, although we're doing subseasonal 16 to 20 HDs right now, it should always be dictated by sort of supply and demand. So what industry and what the participants want to do. So I think we're always open to spinning off or maybe even, changing to a different contest, or, we've even talked about like maybe the idea, we're just brainstorming here, but like you have one that sort of is static, like maybe the 16 to 20, the subseasonal or something like that is always there. But then maybe on 3-month cycles or 6-month cycles, we try different contests, right? We try a severe weather contest in the spring, and we try a hurricane contest in the summer, and so on,
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's open for discussion for sure.
Awesome. Doc, anything you want to add on, or are you still on mute?
Yeah, according to the chat boards, he's unable to. No, we can't hear him, but he can hear us. So.
Oh, okay. All right.
We'll try and figure that out for next week to make sure he.
Okay.
Can, speak.
All right, so we've got about 2 minutes left here. So if anyone has any closing thoughts, remarks, comments, concerns, etc.
I'm
That would be the
concerned
time.
about next week's verification. That's about it.
Yeah, aren't we all?
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting, are we going to bite? Because, how many times have we thought that it would go one way?
Yep.
All right, so I guess that wraps this up. Thanks everyone, and special thanks to our guests from the University of Missouri. Hope to have you back soon. I think next week, I think you said. And thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you for the opportunity. You all take care.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, you too.